There's a little bit of double standards when it comes to editorial. A lot of comic fans like editorial or basically demand that there's more editorial when a story quality is poor or when there's too many events or things are out of control. But at the same time, they also tend to support creators they like, saying that editorial interference should not get in the way of them telling the story they want to tell. It's a bit of a tough line to go down where you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Editorial, I think, as general as a job in comics is poorly understood. But let's talk for a moment about what editorial should do and where that boundary exists. Hey everybody, this is Perch talking about comic book editorial and why it's such a sticky subject. It's a weird one because a lot of people misunderstand what editorial does, and I think there's been a lot of interviews and other things over the years where on both sides, either creators who didn't like editorial or editors who have gone on to do different things, tend to represent kind of what they did in a little bit more stark light, one direction or another. Depending on who you talk to, editorial could be the gatekeepers between horrible, disastrous messes going out. Could be finding creators for projects, keeping them on schedule, on track, so the comic books can actually ship. It could be going out and searching and finding the great talent of tomorrow. Could be helping comics feed nicely into each other so you have tight continuity. But on the other end of the spectrum, you often get comments that editorial prevented creators from doing what they do, or a huge story arc was defeated in the last moment by editorial coming in and changing an ending, or severely ruining everything that a story was building up to. And this isn't a new phenomenon. People, may look at this just in the last 5 to 10 years of history, but you can go back to the 70s and you can find examples of creators and editorial clashing. Um, I have my own opinions on editorial, and I've given them in the past on this channel many, many times. But I think there's a couple elements you can pull out that are universally true, no matter what you believe, no matter which side of things they are on. And the first is editorial is inconsistent. And when I say inconsistent, I just mean from one company to another, or even from one editorial office to another, the roles and tasks and duties of the editors are very, very different. How Jordan White handles Jonathan Hickman and the X-Men universe is different from how Alana Smith handles the Avengers tie-ins and some of those books that she edits. It's a very different behavior, and a lot of that depends on the creators that come in. You'll see very different things from DC to Marvel, but it's not a one size fits all, which makes it more complicated when you're talking about editorial. Is you can almost always find one example where it's not the way it's being described. There's because it's done different ways. It's never easy to pigeonhole or define simply. Um, the other thing I think is universally true is that editorial as a role strengthens and weakens over time. So during the 80s, I think editorial was a lot stronger. I think it carried a heavier stick. I think there was more of an impact with the story. You'd even have some, creators who are arguable superstars that are, basically are under the control of editorial. Editorial had the final say on things, and there were exceptions certainly, but generally speaking, editorial did have the buck stops here kind of mode. And in the last, say, 10 to 20 years, it's much different. How editorial handled a Chris Claremont or a John Byrne is different from how editorial has handled a Brian Michael Bendis or a Tom King, for example. It's just different. And how Tom King is handled in Marvel is different from how Tom King is handled in DC. And that's kind of to my earlier point. Or maybe even a better example is Tom Taylor. Tom Taylor has done work X-Men Red for Marvel. He's done Deceased, however you want to say it. You should say it probably how it's actually spelled, rather than invent new words like I do. Anyway, the control of Tom Taylor at Marvel versus the control of Tom Taylor at DC is very different. And I think that leads me to my third comment, which is some creators flourish under editorial control and some do not. I would draw out, for example, that Tom Taylor's work does tend to do better when an editor is guiding kind of the approach, where it's not just as free form. It's always hard to get somebody to admit this, who's a creator. They don't like to admit that their work is better when edited or controlled or shaped in some fashion. They like to be their own king, their own controller of their destiny. But it's a true statement to say that some people benefit from collaboration. Some people benefit from somebody poking out. Some writers. I think Jonathan Hickman's an example. Is very good at continuity and juggling kind of various balls in the air and getting a lot of things going. Al Ewing, as a writer, tends to have more of that mind toward continuity and juggling these different topics. Other writers do not. I'm trying to think. Jason Aaron, for example, seems to benefit from having editors or somebody else being kind of continuity shepherds. Kelly Thompson, I don't know how she feels about it personally, but I've noticed that when she's partnered up with an editor who's paying more attention to continuity, it tends to work better. I think the same thing's true with G. Willow Wilson and Kelly Sue DeConnick. I think they tend to operate a little better when they have some editorial. I think Matt Fraction is actually a perfect example of somebody who you see a pretty big range of his work depending on the strength of the editor that's with him. Whereas on the other end, I think Rick Remender tends to benefit when left to his own devices more. I think he tends to self-edit, and I think he gets things moving a little bit better just on his own. So I don't think there's a single answer for anyone, and I think it's there's no shame in it if you work better or worse under a collaborator. I think there's always strengths and weaknesses to everything. The other part about editorial, I think that is a true statement, is that editorial is overworked. Now, the reasons for this may vary, and I think that how you feel about editorial kind of may guide some of how you feel about this statement. But it is a true statement that editors are applied to more books, more comics than they used to be. They're spread more thin. And on top of that, the books are doing kind of double shipping at certain cases, or there's just a more variety to the shipping schedule and other parts of how the books are produced. So I think it's a less straightforward job than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. And on top of that, editors seem to just have more volume that they have to produce. They also seem to have more fiscal and budgetary requirements than they used to, certainly at the big two. And I think the other factor there is, and again, people may disagree. I get comic creators from time to time. I get editors. This is one of those topics where I know I'll get some agreement, some disagreement. But I'm just trying to lay out the facts as best I know them. And granted, your individual situation may be very different, of course. The other thing that I think is true with editorial that I suspect will get some pushback on is editors are not being trained or groomed like they used to be. There used to be a really good system for kind of mentorship and kind of learning the ropes and the ins and outs and a safety net, especially for newer editors coming into the mix, or even editors who've been there for a little bit of time, but the world has changed. There used to be more support. That's what I've heard from creators like, I think John Byrne has talked about this. I think Jim Shooter has certainly talked about it. Even Chris Claremont, even Bob Harris, I know has made some comments to this effect. But there's been more of a structure, I think, for creators than there is today, or for editorial, for everybody, but for editorial than there is today. Now, some would argue it's not necessary. Some who are in that kind of managerial position would say no, they do plenty of help. I got this comment from I think Tom Brevoort once said something to the effect of people know how to get a hold of me if they need to get a hold of me. I'm always available. And granted, he may have been referring to some other things, but that may be a true statement. But if you've ever worked in a company where you're a manager, there's just being available, and then there's actually offering help. Those are kind of two different things. People who are newer in their career, who are more novices, don't always ask for help, either because they don't know how to or they're afraid of looking stupid. So it's one of those cases where you say, hey, I'm always, the manager say, I'm always available. Why didn't you come to my office and knock on my door and help? Why didn't you ask for help? I would have helped you. But if you're not then going to help, Or if you're expecting somebody who is a junior level to have the own self motivation, self energy to actually come and ask you for help, you're probably going to be waiting for a very long time. It's just not. There's a lot of psychological reasons, a lot of reasons why that may not happen, especially with a dispersed workforce. It's even less likely to happen. You have to be proactive as a manager. It's one of the reasons they, in theory, pay you the big bucks. But I think these are all ways that editorial has shifted and shaped. And I'm going to do a couple more videos around what editors actually do, what some of the requirements are, and why it's a tough job. It is a tough job. Now, that doesn't mean that people get to be excused for doing it poorly. I think several people do the job very, very poorly, and I think that's a factor in all this. But at the same time, I think companies and managers and senior managers have a responsibility to set people up to success. Maybe they don't always do that. Maybe they don't always accomplish that success, but they're at least put in a position. The manager should try to make people successful and put that effort out. And I think a lot of what I see, in particular with editorial and staff jobs at comics, is that there's very little safety net. There's very little training. There's very little done to actually help make people successful. And then, of course, they're not. And I think that falls, is certainly on the worker, but equally on the shoulders of the manager who should have done more. But anyway, what do you think? We'll dive into editorial a little bit more. Is this a topic that interests you? Are you curious about this role it plays and how it changes over time? Love to know your comments below. Leave your thoughts. Like, subscribe if you haven't already. Introduce to a friend. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook at Comic Perch. And thanks for listening.